Good morning. Happy summer day. So this morning I want to talk about your body. So you are all here, sitting here listening to me. You are in your body. In English we might say you are in the flesh. In other words, you are here and not somewhere else. And the matter of your body matters, because if you were not in your body in some way, you wouldn't be able to hear me speaking. Your body matters. So let's begin by having you check in with your body for a moment, becoming aware and conscious of your body. Perhaps you might feel the weight of your body sitting on the pew. And as I am talking, perhaps you might begin to become aware of your breathing in and out. In fact, why don't you see if you can become aware of your flesh? Perhaps you can feel the temperature of the room with the flesh of your face. Maybe your breath coming in and out over your upper lip, or perhaps your clothing pushing down on the flesh of your shoulder. Now take a moment and think about your body. Now mark those first thoughts that come to your mind, and I wonder how many of those first thoughts are judgmental, like I am like good or bad, or fat or skinny, or ugly or beautiful, or I wish it worked. Or perhaps observations like my left knee hurts. Now as you're thinking about your body, I wonder if any of you have had any thoughts about your body and its relationship to your spiritual life, if you thought about your body in theological terms. So let's take a moment here and see if you can ponder your body from a theological perspective, from a spiritual perspective, and what does God think of your body? And what is the godly purpose of your body? Why does your matter matter? And how about your body and the spiritual life? Does your body have any bearing on your spiritual life? I wish we had a collective mind reader, kind of like the New York Times ticker tape. So right across, just beneath the cross here, we could have what was running through everybody's mind, those who could keep on the topic. And I wonder how many of the thoughts that you've had, that we had collectively, are positive, like Imago Dei, I am made in the image of God, or St. Paul's insight question, do you not know that your body is a temple of the Holy Spirit within you, which you have from God, and that you are not your own, you are a temple? I wonder how many had negative thoughts about the body, thinking of your body as a place of sin to be conquered. After all, our Christian tradition has a lot of that in it. We have a history of mortification of the flesh, the history of our predecessors beating their bodies in order to cause pain, in order to subdue in order to subdue sinful desires. And that whole rising up of the mortification of the flesh actually comes in some part from the passage that was read today from Romans, and that is, for if you live according to the flesh, you will die. But if by the Spirit you put to death the deeds of the body, you will live. So we're still in the questioning part of this. So what do you think Christianity has to say about the body? A lot of you have put a lot of time into church. Catechism classes, you've read books. Does Christianity have a positive or negative opinion of the body? It's possible that at every turn your answers are somewhat confused or confusing. So did you ever go to church and hear a reading from Paul, and at the end of the reading the lector says, "The word of the Lord," and the congregation says, "Thanks be to God," and you're sitting there and you say, "Thanks be to God," because I had absolutely no idea what was going on in that reading. Paul's letters take up 28% of the New Testament. So that's 50,000 words if you count it by word, those letters attributed to Paul. And so what Paul has to say about spiritual formation or Christian theology matters to us. And sometimes Paul has some very confusing things to say about the body. And so therefore our tradition to some degree has gotten quite confused about our bodies. And this is, of course, massively ironic because of all the world's religion, we are the one that puts our stake in the ground about the body. Boom! The incarnation, Christmas. That's what Christmas is. It's the Feast of the Incarnation. God becoming man in the flesh. That's what all those great, not all, but many of those great Christmas carols are about. And yet, there's a holiness that Jesus brings to the flesh that sometimes gets lost. And so, with Paul, we sometimes get mightily confused with Paul, and there's a lot of reasons for that. First is, oftentimes, Paul's letters are about topics, or he's working through issues that are no longer deeply meaningful to us, right? And he's way into things that we don't think really anything about. The second thing is that Paul's sentence structure would not pass 9th grade at the New Canaan public school system here, right? He has very long sentences periodically, and we've anglicized that and added commas, but if you're just listening, it goes on and on and on, and sometimes it's a little hard to know what he's getting at. And thirdly, Paul uses the same words and phrases in his letters in many, many different ways. So just because you think you know the meaning of what it meant in Corinthians doesn't mean you know what he's talking about in Galatians. In fact, it doesn't mean you know what he's talking about in the next sentence in whatever letter you're reading. And then just to top it off, the words that Paul uses are used in a meaning in antiquity, and now 21 centuries later, we attach a completely different meaning to that same word. So we might hear it and take it at face value and completely miss the point. So today, all four of those issues apply to the reading that we just got on Paul's letter to the Romans. And in Paul's letter to the Romans, we have chapter 8, verses 1 to 11, but the real passage, or known pericope as they call it, scholars call it, actually goes to verse 14. So what I'm going to talk about, I'm extending the rest of the reading a few bits and pieces here. And so Paul's confusion around the body comes greatly through the passage we just heard. And now, on the positive side about the body, you ready? The Spirit of God dwells in you. Christ is in you. The Spirit of Him, that is the Father, who raised Jesus from the dead, dwells in you. He who raised Christ from the dead will give life to your mortal bodies also through His Spirit that dwells in you. So there it is, very positive. In other words, your body is a temple to the Holy Spirit, right? Because the Holy Spirit is alive in your body, the Spirit of Christ. On the other side, on the negative side, same reading, we hear, weakened by the flesh, sinful flesh. The flesh is death. The mind that is set on the flesh is hostile to God. Those who are in the flesh cannot please God. The body is dead because of sin. If you live according to the flesh, you will die. Put to death the deeds of the body, and you will live. Okay, so all this points toward our bodies either being sinful or vials for sin or leaning toward evil or something of the sort. So let's untangle this a little bit. Flesh and the body. To begin, Paul uses the term flesh in 6 different ways in his letters. Okay, 6 completely different meanings of the word flesh. And then within each of these 6 categories, there's a nuanced difference oftentimes within the way he is describing these in using this word. But no matter what, when Paul uses the term in the flesh, in the reading this morning, he does not mean what I started my sermon by saying, which is, you are here in the flesh. In other words, you're physically present. You know that kind of phrase like, hey, Tom Berardino in the flesh, right? I mean, in other words, you're here, right? Tom is here. That's not what Paul is talking about at all. He's also not talking about this, like flesh, body. He's not talking about that either. So when Paul says in the flesh, he's actually not talking about the body at all, even though we associate flesh with our bodies, right? So in this case, when Paul says in the flesh, he's talking about our rebellious human nature. That part of us which is like Ecclesiastes, what is that, 3:5, trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not unto your own understanding. He's talking about those who lean unto their own understanding and do not trust in the Lord with all their heart. That's what Paul is talking about. And so when he says people who are in the flesh, what he's talking about are people who they're lost in self-absorption, right? Indulging in and building their lives around their own self-centeredness. They're building their own castle, and that they measure the value of their lives not by any godly measure, but by, their culture or whatever they make up, right? And to be in the flesh is to be in that awful place where our addictions and our compulsions are the driving forces of our lives. Addictions and compulsions become the interior law of the land. And what Paul says, all of that adds up to spiritual death. So in the passage that we just heard, right, Paul is contrasting in the flesh with in the spirit, and what he is talking about here is the difference between kind of rebellious human nature, which he knows a lot about, because we see that in all of his letters. He does say to us, I desire to do one thing and I do just the opposite. And that's how we can all identify with Paul, because that's that rebellious part of us that just don't do what we want it to do kind of thing. And then we have this in the Spirit. So to be in the Spirit is to be in the flow of God. As we might say, mind, body, and soul in the flow, right? It's a place of godly fruitfulness where our lives vibrate with the presence of God within us, and that vibration, that divine vibration, draws the dispositions of our heart toward God, so that fully lived out, our lives become sacramental, outward manifestations of the inward spiritual reality of Christ within us. That's a sacramental life, and that's people who are in the Spirit, right? The presence of God in their lives, at the heart of their being, is the driving force of your life. That's what it means to be in the Spirit. And it is a very unitive place. In other words, who you are, what you do, and who you be in your being is to some degree in communion with the divine three, right? Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. So you're like a radio dial attuned and tuned in. And so from this perspective, to be in the Spirit means that our bodies were created by God for holiness. We were created for the presence of God. That's what we're created for. And the dramas and dispositions of our hearts that we all have are intended to be channeled in what Jesus calls the stream of living water that flows out of believers' hearts. Remember that story? And so we are to channel our stuff into that stream and kind of like kayaking in the stream of God, living in the stream of the Spirit. And we all know what that experience is like if you've ever felt alive, really alive, or awakened, or refreshed in the Spirit, or to have your heart strangely warmed, as the Wesleys talked about, right? And sometimes even born again. That's the power of being in the Spirit versus being in the flesh. The born again story starts from those who are in the flesh to those who experience coming into the Spirit. That's how they metaphorically describe the difference. And so, for the most part, Paul was a Hebrew man, and he was raised in the Hebrew world, but he interacted much with the Hellenistic world, and the Hebrew world and the Hellenistic world had different opinions of the body. The Hebrew world had a very positive experience in theology of the body, and the Neoplatonic world of antiquity had a very negative view of the body. The Neoplatonists thought of the body as a soul cage, right? A kind of evilish place, oftentimes. And in the Hebrew side, the body was not separated, not like mind, body, and spirit, or mind, body, and soul, as we would say. They have body, soul, right? It's all one. There's no separating it. You can't pull them apart. So you'd either write it with a hyphen, or maybe you'd make it one word. There's two concepts for one. But Paul is trying to explain to his people, and we are his people, right, is that we are not just body, soul, we're body, soul temples. That's the big point, that we are temples. Now, this is the big idea. That's the thing that can get all so screwy, is that we are all temples of the Holy Spirit, and as such, temples of the Spirit of Christ. I wonder how many of you had that thought when you were going through your body scan or your think scan. I wonder how many of you have to tell me. If anybody at the back door says to me, I was there before you were, dude. I was there on the temple thing. And so we would say, what Paul is trying to say to us is, we are actually the church, right? So you are like a little church. And we know that because theologically we've got this other piece of it down. We know that if all of the church buildings in the world went away, right? All the church buildings go away, we are still the church, right? Flesh and blood is the church. And we are holy, but we're not holy because we're good. We're holy because the Spirit of Christ is within us. That's what makes us the church, and that's what makes us holy. And so, even though we spend a lot of time on hammering in the flesh, and you may be confused, the truth is you are the church sitting in the church. And when you go about your life, and you go about your desire to sanctify, to live more deeply in the Spirit of Christ, it isn't a long-distance phone call. It isn't a long-distance issue. All you're doing is coming in touch with that spirit, that vibration that is already in you, and you're simply drawing closer to that, and then the reverberations of that spread out from your life and into the whole world. And to live in that spirit, man, that's the awesomeness. That's what it's about.